Midnight at the tower. The blue light confession. The blue emergency lights on the quad were flashing when I realized something impossible. The intruder's chalk message used my handwriting, my loops, my slant lines I'd never written. I'm Noah Reyes, 25, a graduate assistant at the University of Texas Special Collections and University Archives. My job is to make paper remember better than people do. On most nights, I shelve history until midnight, then I run the long way home across the main mall under the tower, thinking about how the limestone keeps its secrets. I love Austin at that hour. The city breathes. The cicadas gossip. You can almost hear the campus let go. But I didn't know yet what I was about to hear. The first chalk message showed up on a Monday, by the granite planter near the blue emergency phone. We don't burn secrets. We misfile them. A librarian joke if there ever was one, except the F in misfile looped down like a hook, exactly the way my hand had learned from a cataloger I adored. I crouched and stared. The slant. The spacing. Even my annoying habit of dotting I's late. My chest tightened. Whoever wrote it had watched me write or watched the remnants of my writing the way a thief watches a lock. But I didn't know who was watching. Hey, a voice said behind me, low and even. Step away from the phone, I stood and turned. The security flashlight made a ring on my shoes first, then climbed to my face. The man holding it was taller than the light made him seem, with shoulders that lived in a uniform like they were born there. Skin like warm night, hair cropped close, a subtle wire curling from his collar to his ear. His name tag said Brooks. Later I'd learned the first name, Elijah. Right then he was simply the guy telling me to back up. Relax, I said, palms up. I work in the archives. Most graffiti artists have cover stories, he said. But his voice didn't carry the cheap cop sarcasm I dreaded. He looked down at the chalk sentence. Cute, he added, which somehow made me flush. I didn't write that, I said. I'm just recognizing the style. Your style? He flicked the beam from the message to my face and then very deliberately clicked it off. We have cameras in the quad. It'll tell us more than handwriting. I believe you, he said, and I didn't expect to feel the relief that moved through me like a warm front. But if someone wants you to find this, that's a different problem. It should have ended there. Chalk, a shrug, a memo. But that sentence kept crawling around in my head long after I'd shelved the last box. I went back to my apartment on East 7th, scanned old notebooks like I might find a copy of the crime. Every letter betrayed me. The slant was mine. The hook was mine. The delay on the dot over the I, that embarrassingly was also mine. I tried to sleep. The cicadas kept writing their own language outside my window. And then my phone buzzed at 2:03 a.m. a no ID text. You misfiled me. My mouth went dry. Who? I typed, then deleted it. Whoever it was had already read too much of me. I stared at the ceiling. I thought about keys. I thought about the tower. I thought about the emergency phone and how the blue light makes your pupils a little bit honest. And then I decided to do something I'm not proud of. I went back to campus alone. But the truly shocking part hadn't happened yet. Ignite the tower. Looks like it's lit from inside with something older than electricity. I crossed the main mall like I was walking into a photo I'd seen too many times. The second chalk message waited on the step to Battle Hall. Noah. Check folder MS1927, box 3. That halted me cold. That was my domain, my shelving pattern, my messy handwriting, and the finding aid margin that only staff sees. I whispered how? To no one. The stone said nothing. Step away from the steps, a voice said, and somehow I was relieved it was the same one. Elijah. The flashlight's ring landed on my shoes first again, and this time. I laughed. You always do the shoes first? People lie with their faces, he said. Their shoes are honest. He looked past me and saw my name in chalk. You want to tell me why your archives box is on the stairs? I should have told him everything. Instead I said, I have a paranoid imagination. He waited. Patience is a kind of interrogation all by itself. I lasted 12 seconds. Okay, I got a text. And whoever is doing this knows my shelving routes, students? He asked, maybe. Or an intern. Or someone who shadowed me. The archives are a nesting doll, small doors inside small doors. If you know a tiny way in, you can make it look like a magic trick. Don't come alone. he said. It sounded like an order. It felt like a hand extended. If you get a message like that again, you wait for me. I must have made a face because he added, it's not just safety. I'm a medic by training. Habitually cautious. Army? I asked. His eyes flickered. Once, he took a photo of the chalk, radioed dispatch, then said, let's check that box. The sentence "we" landed inside me with the soft weight of a blanket. I nodded. We crossed into the archive building. The door recognized my ID. Elijah stood slightly behind and to the left of me, a geometry of protection I didn't know I needed until I had it. We walked the dim aisles. The old paper smell is my incense. When I pulled MS 1927 Box 3, my hands shook. Inside, under an inventory of student newspapers from the 1970s, a folded page waited, a photocopy of a typed letter. Elijah looked at me. Read it, he said. His voice had changed, lower, careful, like you handle a wounded thing. The letter was dated in the 70s, addressed to a dean, alleging that a graduate student had been discouraged from publishing a report about lab safety violations. It named a professor who would later become a campus celebrity, their lectures, their books, all light. The signature of the grad student was a name I didn't know. At the bottom, a handwritten note, they won't file this. So the handwriting wasn't mine. But the slant was familiar from somewhere in the archive, like a song you can't place. The letter had been misfiled into a series where no one would think to look. A perfect way to keep a secret without burning it. Someone wants this found, Elijah said, or wants me to find it. I said, why you? Because they know I won't know how to leave it alone. He smiled for the first time. It was smaller than I'd imagined and brighter. Then don't, he said. We made a copy. We logged the letter. I wrote an incident memo like a good archivist. Elijah wrote his report like a good security sergeant. We both avoided the gravity of what we were actually doing, pulling on a thread connected to 40 years of carpet. At the door, he said, where do you live? I told him. He nodded like he was marking a map I couldn't see. Text me, he added, surprising me, and read off a number I added as Elijah, Knight. He didn't add mine. He didn't need to. Knight has a way of keeping lists. Back in my apartment, the cicadas were still talking. I wasn't sleeping when the next text came. Box 5, no good night. No punctuation. A set of coordinates if you understood me. I typed waiting. Then I sent Elijah the same word. Wait for me, he'd said. I sat on my couch and counted my breath. I learned in that hour that waiting can be a kind of love you offer a stranger. But the thing that actually changed everything hadn't arrived yet. Elijah's knock was soft and precise. He didn't step in. He said, ready? Like we were leaving a hotel early for a flight. I nodded. The walk to campus felt different. He didn't talk much. I filled the quiet with hypotheses the way anxious people trim silence. Maybe it's a retired professor, I said. Or someone finishing what the letter writer started. Or a student who thinks I'm a romantic. He laughed under his breath. What? Nothing, he said. Just the word romantic coming from an archivist. We date the dead, I said. He didn't laugh that time. I mean, we date their papers, I added, which somehow made it worse. He shook his head and grinned. This one bigger, easier. You're fine, he said. Just be careful who you let read you. The chalk at Battle Hall that night said, Box 5, then the tower. Elijah's jaw moved like he was chewing a thought. They're escalating, he said. We don't go near the tower without eyes everywhere. He radioed dispatch, asked for a quad camera sweep, then followed me to the stacks. MS to 1927. Box 5 held student petitions about safety protocols, photocopied and underlined. The same name from the letter appeared in the margins, arguing with a pen about doused fires and used gloves. The file was clean. No fresh note. Elijah and I looked at each other, and for a second I felt like we were standing at the lip of a pool deciding to go under at the same time. The tower next, he said. We crossed the main mall. The tower watched us like it had seen this before. Past midnight, the quad's blue emergency lights gave the grass a submarine glow. Near the base of the tower, chalk again, ring, ring, blue. Elijah frowned. They want to pull the blue phone, he said. No. He stepped up to the emergency phone and pressed the button himself. The speaker crackled. Dispatch answered, and Elijah said, "Training run," like a pilot. He hung up, then turned. "We do this on our terms." He crouched and studied the chalk letters. "Your hand?" he asked. "Yes," I said, feeling the strangeness of admitting a fingerprint that wasn't mine. "Someone's traced me. Or trained on you," he said. He was right. We found out how later. Right then, another flashlight joined ours, and a second security officer radioed something I didn't catch. Elijah straightened. His posture changed. The ex-medic posture got a layer of command. "Sergeant?" The officer said. Camera 4 picked a figure moving south across the mall, hoodie up, timing with the phone press. "Direction?" Elijah asked. "Toward the West Mall, then lost in the trees." "Get eyes at the drag," Elijah said. And the officer peeled away. Elijah looked at me. "You need to go home," he said. Now, that wasn't a suggestion. The way he said it made my body obey. We walked fast to the edge of campus. At the sidewalk, he finally said, "If they're training on your hand, they've watched you work. Or they have samples. Or they're inside." The last word hung between us like a wet shirt. "Lock your door," he added. "Text me from inside." I did. His reply was a single dot. More effective somehow than paragraphs. We didn't sleep. I watched the window get lighter. I read the letter again. I made coffee and didn't drink it. And then, at 6:58 a.m., another text. "Today, noon. The tower." I wrote no and didn't send it. Elijah wrote first. "You got it too?" I answered yes. He replied, "We're not letting you go alone." He didn't write who he was. I imagined a phalanx, then remembered it would probably just be Elijah and his patients. Noon had the heat of a dare. Students flowed like bright fish. The tower was as public as it gets. If the chalk writer wanted visibility, they chose well. Elijah stood with 2 officers near the base. He looked different in daylight, not less careful, just easier, like a song you hum instead of play. He nodded at me. "Stay in my shade," he said. Literally, we waited. Nothing happened. Then a person in a hoodie and a baseball cap walked up the main mall with an ordinary posture and extraordinary calm. No rush, no fidget. They carried a manila folder like they were turning in a late assignment. They stopped 10 feet away. "Noah Reyes," they said. The voice was bright and genderless. "Yes," I said, and my name in someone else's mouth felt like being picked up by the collar. They held out the folder. "This belongs where you'll put it. Because you'll put it somewhere people can actually find it." Elijah stepped between us. "What's your name?" The person smiled. "I have one." "Then give it to me." "Not to you." They offered the folder over his shoulder. I reached because I am a man who reaches for paper. Elijah's hand landed on my wrist before my fingers closed. He shook his head once. "Open it," he told the person. They opened the folder themselves. Inside were copies upon copies. Lab memos from the 1970s, typed, stamped. A photo of the smiling professor we recognized. Petitions. A second letter, unsigned. And on top, a page of my handwriting, lifted from an old finding aid. The letters traced and practiced in pencil like scales on a staff. My scalp went cold. "How did you get that?" I asked. The person tilted their head. "Do you lock your discard bins? The handwriting samples in the copy room recycle?" Shame is humid. It sits. "You went through everyone's trash," they said, bright as if they were listing groceries. "I needed your hand." People pay attention to words that look like they belong to someone. Elijah's voice flattened. "Step back," he said. "Put the folder down." The person looked at him like he'd asked them to recite the periodic table. Then they did step back. They put the folder on the ground. They raised their palms. "I'm not the story," they said, eyes on me. "He is." And then, as if we were in a badly scripted scene, they pointed past us. "Him." I turned. A man who could have been anyone was walking away from the crowd, khakis, linen shirt, silver hair, sunglasses. I didn't know him. Elijah did. The ex-army medic face left, and the campus sergeant face arrived like a mask clicking into place. Professor Hale, he called. The man kept walking. Elijah moved. The other officers moved. The person in the hoodie smiled like we'd hit their cue. Students slowed. The heat found another degree. I didn't know who to watch. Elijah caught up to Holly near the base of the steps and set a light hand on his shoulder, light enough to be polite, firm enough to mean what it meant. You have a minute? Holly turned. He took off his sunglasses. His eyes were the green of old glass. He was, I realized, famous. I'd seen his books in the campus bookstore. He was also, I realized, annoyed. For what? He asked a few questions about old lab files. Elijah said, Hale's face did a thing that would look like surprise in a courtroom and like guilt in a novel. He smiled instead. I'm late for a meeting. You're right on time, Elijah said softly. Right now. The hoodie person had drifted closer to me. He wants to be seen as the hero, they whispered. I'll play along. He's practiced. Who are you? I asked. Someone you misfiled, they said. And for a second I felt the wind go through the tower. Not personally, they added when they saw my face. Institutionally. Give me your name, I said. They looked at the officers, then at Elijah, then back at me. Later, they said, and that later sounded like a door closing. But here's where everything actually changed. Haldy didn't run. He didn't argue. He didn't confess. He simply looked at the folder on the ground, at me, at Elijah, at the tower, and with the arrogance I've only seen in people who believe their story is the only story that matters. He said, I saved this place. By burying risks? Elijah asked. By avoiding hysteria, Hale said. Someone got hurt, the hoodie person said. Their voice sharpened. Someone's. Hale's jaw clicked. Regulations were different. We learned. He looked at me. You're the archivist. You know context. Context is not an alibi. But people try to make it one. I picked up the folder because I had to. I felt Elijah's eyes on me like a seatbelt. The crowd made a circle and did what crowds do, recorded. Elijah tilted his head, the small movement that I think meant we go to a room now. He said softly, Professor Hale, please come with us. Hale nodded like that had been his idea all along. We didn't put cuffs on anyone. We did put the folder in an evidence bag. I watched my own handwriting in the bag and felt strange, framed and used, and also sickly proud. The way you feel when your dog learns a trick you didn't want it to know. Elijah stood closer to me than he had to. I realized I could smell his soap. I realized I wanted to keep breathing at Dot in the security office. The hours went slow. The hoodie person gave a statement and a name, River, which sounded chosen and maybe was. They described their volunteer shifts, their discovery of my discarded notes, their decision to use my hand like a lantern. They did not apologize. They did not boast. They said, he needed to be seen, meaning Hale. And then looking at me, so did you. I didn't know what to do with that sentence. So I filed it in the folder inside me where I put things I'll feel later. Hale did what men like him do. He told a story, in the key of benevolent sacrifice. He said he'd kept quiet because public panic would have cost lives. He said the violations weren't violations back then. He said the graduate student exaggerated. He said time changes definitions. He said he was tired. He said he was a good man. Elijah listened the way a doctor listens to lungs. We'll let the documents talk, he said finally. And it was a diagnosis and a mercy at once, Dot at some point. While the room rearranged chairs around stories, Elijah and I ended up alone in the break room. The window there looks at a blank wall. It might as well be a confessional. I leaned on the counter. He leaned on the other end. He looked at my hands like he was counting the places they'd shaken. You okay? He asked. You said to be careful who I let read me, I said. I think I got read by a performance artist and a grandstanding saint. Saints always have good press, he said, and performance artists always have good timing. He smiled. And archivists have good memory. And security sergeants? I asked. Good attention, he said. And worse coffee. He handed me a cup. It was terrible. It helped. I wanted to say thank you and don't leave, and I liked the part where you said we. Instead I said, you were Army. It wasn't a question. He looked at the blank wall and then at me again. Medic, he said. How did you get from there to here? He took a breath like he was putting a catheter line into a sentence. I thought I was done holding people together, he said. Turns out I like holding places together too. He set his cup down. Places are made of people. This one is too. He looked at my shirt like it had a map on it. You, specifically. That should have made me laugh. It made my throat tight. You talk like an archivist, I said. He shrugged. I read, we didn't touch. That came later. We did stand there for a long minute staring at a bad wall like it was the ocean, and sometimes that's enough to move a boat. The next days were meetings and memos and the tense ballet of a university protecting itself while pretending not to. River got found by reporters and stood taller instead of hiding. Hale got found by his own words and tried to dance around them like he'd never choreographed the steps. Students made signs, some ridiculous, some beautiful. One said, "Visible is safer than hidden." I didn't make it. I wanted to dot at night, when the quad thinned and the blue emergency phones hummed like tall beacons. Elijah and I walked the mall. He'd say, "Shoes are honest," and point at some kids' destroyed sneakers and we'd make up their story together. He'd say, "Places are made of people," and I'd correct him, and paper, and he'd let me be right. We did not talk about what we were doing with our mouths in the air between us. We didn't need to. The last chalk message appeared on a Friday 2 weeks after the tower noon. It wasn't at the blue phone. It wasn't by Battle Hall. It was on the lowest step up to the tower, small enough you could miss it, simple enough you couldn't. I'm here. I looked at Elijah. He looked at me. Yours? He asked. No, I said. But I wish. He took the chalk from where it lay like a dropped baton. He wrote very carefully next to the tiny words, "Me too." His handwriting was ugly as sin. I loved it. When the door to the tower opened and the security guards came out, one of them shouted my name, Noah. And for a half second, my stomach felt like I'd done something wrong. Then I realized they were smiling. You're going to want to see this, the older one said. And in another story, this is where the villain runs and the hero chases. But in ours, something quieter and bigger happened. We followed them inside, up one level, into a room that smelled like old wire and rain. On a table sat 3 boxes. Not ours facilities. The older guard said, "This is from a maintenance crawl space. We found them after the sweep." He lifted a lid. Inside were copies of the same memos River had carried. Plus the original letter. I'd found a photocopy of the one with the grad student's signature. And under that, in a sleeve, a tiny cassette tape. The label said only 1977. My breath made a ghost in the cool air. Elijah looked at me and did the smallest nod I've ever seen. "Do your job?" it meant. I did. We logged the tape. We signed the chain of custody. We found an old player. We pressed play, a voice. Young, careful, like they were trying to be older than they were. I don't know why I'm recording. Because paper burns. Because if I say it out loud, I might remember how to live with it. A chair scraped. A pause. A second voice, older, measured, said, "We'll fix it in committee." The young voice, "You can't fix exposure in committee." A door closed. The tape clicked. The room changed temperature, or I did. I turned the player off. I turned it on. I turned it off again. I looked at Elijah. He looked at me. His eyes were not soft or hard. They were present. "We'll take care of it," he said. And if he'd said you, I would have been terrified. It was a building you could live in. We did take care of it. The tape didn't go to the press first. It went to the archive. We did a provisional intake. We kept it cold. We made high-res digital. We contacted legal. We contacted ethics. We contacted the living grad student whose name I had read and didn't know and now would never forget. They were old now. They cried. They laughed. They said it didn't matter, and that it mattered more than anything. Both were true. I held the tape once more before we shelved it. It was light. I could imagine it on a day in 1977 when someone pressed a red button and told the future a small truth and hoped it was enough. Maybe that's all we ever do. On the quad, the chalk washed away in the first rain. The blue phones hummed. The tower kept radiating. Students took pictures. Reporters filed stories with words like reckoning and healing. Those are easy to print and hard to live. Elijah and I learned the slow work of both. One night, when the cicadas were louder than the engines, he walked me to the edge of campus and stopped by the blue phone where it had started. He said, "I don't like grand gestures," and I said, "Good, because neither do I." He said, "But I like the way you catalog small things." I said, "I like the way you stand to my left like the world is a hallway." He smiled and did that hurtingly small nod. And before I could decide another thing about my life, he reached up and touched my jaw with the backs of his fingers like he was checking for a fever, and then leaned in and kissed me. It was unremarkable the way the first sip of water is unremarkable until you remember you are thirsty. I put my palm against the place where his neck meets his shoulder and felt the steadiness of his pulse and thought, I want to keep cataloging this. We didn't promise anything dramatic. We promised the night. We promised the next morning. We promised the patient word here. That was enough. The day after the tape story broke on campus, a thin envelope arrived at the archive addressed to me. No return. Inside, a single index card. In pencil, my slant but not mine. I learned your hand because I needed your attention. Now you won't misfile me. River. Underneath, a cramped PS. He saved nothing. You did. I felt the pride I didn't want and the humility I did. I walked to the quad with Elijah that night. The blue phone hummed. The tower glowed. He reached for my hand without asking. I let him. People passed us and didn't look twice. We kept walking. Sometimes the safest place is not a room with locks. Sometimes it's a sentence you say at the same time as someone else. I'm here, I said. Me too, he said. And the light stayed blue. And we stayed visible, and the archive at last filed us where we belonged.